Hey, welcome back. We are week 3, the Great Decisions. Glad to see you all here. Do you like this space better than the other space? Good. I want to tell you about a few things coming up, as per usual. You know, hustle all the World Affairs Council programs we have. This Sunday, if you are not inclined toward the medieval celebration of headbutting and commercials that are really interesting, you can come to the Portland Art Museum at 2 p.m. where we are co-sponsoring Lisa Shannon, who has a new book called Mama Coco and the 100 Gunmen, an extraordinary tale of love, loss, and survival in the Congo, which we are presenting in conjunction with the Richard Moss exhibition, The Enclave. It is a wonderful, wonderful book. It has a great Portland-Congo connection built into it. The lead, the sort of central figure in it is a Portlander, a Congo expat who worked at the cheese counter at Fred Meyer, and the journey back to Congo into the middle of the hornet's nest of Joseph Kony. It's very, very moving, and I think it'll be a great program. Coming up next Thursday, February 5th, 7 p.m. in our offices, Kambiz Ghania Basiri from Reed College will be talking about can we ever move past racism? And he's looking at, in the wake of recent events, both here and abroad, how can we live up to the pluralistic promise of this great nation of ours? And can we envision a post-racial America, and more than can we envision it, can we actually make it happen? It should be a very good program. He wrote a great essay for Islamic Monthly recently on this subject, and it is very, very good. I would encourage you all to read it and come to the event with some great questions so we can talk about it. And then February 8th, we are co-sponsoring a film for the Portland International Film Festival, a very breathtaking and emotional film called On the Way to School, which looks at 4 young people in 4 corners of the globe and the arduous journeys that they have to undertake every day to get an education. So these are kids in Morocco, in Patagonia, in India, and there is one other one, there's 4 of them, Kenya. Kids who are going 18 kilometers on the back of a horse or walking 22 kilometers over the Atlas Mountains to get an education. The trailer alone will make you bawl. It's fantastic. So February 8th, 4 p.m., Witzel Auditorium. And then we presented a wonderful speaker from U of O last year named Young Zhao, who is an expert on not only our education system, but the Chinese education system. And he has a new book called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? Why China Has the Best and Worst Education System in the World. And he will be speaking Tuesday, February 17th at the Oregon Historical Society in the pavilion downstairs. He is fantastic. We could not contain enough people in the room when we presented him last year. If he were not an educational theorist and incredible thinker on these issues, he could very easily be a stand-up comedian. So I encourage you to come back for that. Today we have, again, a very, very above the fold, ripped from the headlines, prescient topic, sectarianism in the Middle East. If you opened up any paper or looked online today, I would bet at least 3 of the 4 top things that are vibrating off of the screen of the page are dealing with some of these issues. And I'm really excited that we have Paul Powers from Lewis and Clark here to talk about it. Paul teaches a range of courses about Islam and religious studies. His courses include Islamic origin, Islam in the modern world, religious fundamentalism, Sufi, Islamic mysticism, and a seminar on Islamic law. And it's, I kind of had to twist his arm to do it, but I knew, someone said, he's the guy, you got to get him, he's the guy. And I said, hey, I hear you're the guy. And he goes, well, I don't know if I'm the guy, but he is the guy. So we're going to have a little bit of Paul talking, and then, of course, we would love to have questions and conversations with you. I'll put a mic down here. If you are not so inclined or you're sitting in the middle to run down, I will try and do my best Montel Williams and walk around the audience with the mic for you. And let's give Paul Powers a big hand.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I'm the guy. That's a lot to live up to. So let's decide that later, whether I am the guy or not. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks to Tim and the rest involved in this series for inviting me and putting this together. This is my first time in this series, and I hope I live up to the high standards that I think other speakers have set. What I'm going to try to do, so I've got a couple of slides to start us off. My PowerPoint is pretty bare bones. It's not a lot of bells and whistles. I hope the content makes up for the lack of flash. And I do have a couple of pictures for later, but mostly it's just going to be a few words on the screen. There's just a couple of quick things about me. I'm not going to go through it quickly. The one thing I did want to emphasize is that I'm not a political scientist. I'm a religious studies scholar. And my training is in a field called history of religions with a focus on Islamic studies. And most of my research has been in various aspects of Islamic law. But I have traveled and spent a lot of time in various parts of the Muslim world, and I pay attention to a lot of these things. So I don't know if I'm offering a deep insider's expert opinion, but I hope I can offer an informed opinion that can help us get a conversation going. So the plan for what I'm going to do today, I basically have three things I want to talk about in my 30 minutes or so before I turn this into more of a conversation. So I'm focusing on the reading that I was told we were all going to be doing together by Mr. Lawrence Potter. So this is the kind of reference text, and I'm going to be assuming you've read it. If you haven't read it, I think what we're going to be talking about will still make enough sense. So it'll be all right. You can don't run out now and try to read it and come back in before we get done. But basically, the piece takes up what I'm calling the sectarianism hypothesis. Then we get, I'm calling them Potter's counterarguments. I'm not entirely sure that he embraces them himself or if he just wants to present them as potential counterarguments. And then I'm going to give you some of my assessment and locate myself relative to this stuff. So I'm going to try to move fairly quickly to save enough time for conversation. So I'll try to keep the kind of pedal on the metal here, and especially when I'm going through what I think is the summary portion of this here at the start. So this is a few words about the sectarianism hypothesis. I have 2 or 3 slides about this, so this is the first of 2 or 3. So the basic hypothesis that Potter talks about, which he basically is asserting is a pretty pervasive one in journalism and kind of popular discourse about what's going on in the Middle East and North Africa these days. And I think he even suggests that it influences things like American foreign policy towards these regions. Right? And the sectarianism hypothesis basically asserts that religious sectarianism is driving. It is one of the, or maybe the driving force in the turmoil of the region. If we get some time, I'd like to come back a little bit to this idea of turmoil, which at the end of the day, I'm going to assert, like sectarianism, is a rather blunt way of trying to talk about a situation. And in some ways, both of these terms, my assessment is going to be, serve to cloud as much as they reveal. And maybe the worst part of them is that I think they serve to try to get people who are partly responsible and potentially helpful off the hook for actually trying to do something more useful in the situation. So the hypothesis here, that's kind of jumping ahead a little. The hypothesis is that people with differing religious commitments harm each other because of those differences, right? Because they have different sectarian identities, different religious commitments, they harm each other over that, right? That's the turmoil, is people harming each other. Sectarianism, the hypothesis would tell us, is age-old and unsolvable. It's always been here, and there's virtually nothing anyone can do about it, right? And sort of my gloss on it, it would suggest that if the problem is basically really a religious problem, the solution has to be a religious solution, that people have to change their faith commitments in order to get us out of this sort of turmoil. And then as Potter focuses in, these days, we seem to have settled on the hypothesis that especially there's a kind of Sunni Shi'i or Shiite tensions, that's a kind of centerpiece. And he talks about the prospect of a kind of resurgent Shi'ism. And this seems like, especially in recent months, to be a kind of widespread position that people are taking up, that's the problem here. So adding a few more details to this element of the sectarianism hypothesis, focusing on a Sunni-Shi'i divide, would suggest that there's a sort of emergent Shi'i bloc, or sometimes we get this sort of supposedly evocative kind of Orientalistic imagery of the crescent, the Shi'i crescent is emerging. And that argument, a little more specifically, is that basically the centerpiece of this is, of course, Iran, and that Iran is now becoming the sort of driving force in the emergence of this unifying Shi'i bloc that connects Iran, the 60% majority Shi'i population of Iraq, the Syrian Shi'is, Lebanese Shi'is, in a kind of this supposedly crescent-shaped zone here. More recently, well, Bahrain it also gets mentioned in this, often kind of left off the map, and then Yemen has been brought into the conversation recently as a particularly problematic place. The assessment right now seems to be that groups located in Yemen were instrumental in training and engineering the attacks in France recently. So Yemen has sort of emerged as this hot spot of concern. Whenever you talk about the Shi'is or the sort of looming influence of Iran in America, of course, the 1979 revolution and the hostage crisis and so forth always sort of looms in the background. And it's difficult not to get the sense that the American, a lot of American attitudes about Iran are very much shaped by a sense of anger and shame over that event that continues to kind of echo in our responses. You say Iran, we say, no, right? Because of that, right? And even something like the current discussions in the Obama administration about the prospect of having a conversation with Iran about their nuclear program. Whether that's a good idea or not is a complicated question, but the response to that is often, I think, a kind of a knee-jerk response that has a lot to do with this sort of unhealed wound in the American psyche over 1979. And then sort of related to this, this aspect of the sectarianism hypothesis is the suggestion that with this sort of assertive Shi'ism going on in the region, something like ISIS, the Islamic State, or the so-called Islamic State, should be seen as a Sunni response to this Shi'i aggression, right? And so these things sort of inform one another, right? Or at least a sort of definitively Sunni sectarian group. And this raises foreign policy and military questions like, does fighting ISIS, which seems to be something that our policy experts would like to do these days, does that do something that our policy experts don't want to do, empower Iran? Is there any way to do one without doing the other, right? All right, so the hypothesis is meant to add precision to our understanding of the situation. And the way that goes is, again, we sort of speak in the sort of blunt terms that we tend to talk about these things, is the problem, in effect, that the Middle East is full of Muslims, right? And that Muslims are just tumultuous, right? Well, that sounds a little too simplistic. So let's take another step and say at least there's two kinds of Muslims, right? And they can't get along with one another. And in effect, that's the sectarianism hypothesis. Now, I'm sort of overdoing it a little bit here just for the sort of exaggeration for the sake of efficiency here. But in some ways, I think that captures something important about the sectarianism hypothesis, right? So it is meant to do something good, which is add precision to our understanding of a complicated situation, right? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the counter-argument that Potter lays out, or various aspects of a counter-argument to the sectarianism hypothesis. And for the most part, just to tip my hand a little bit, I mostly agree with Potter. You can hear already in my discussions of the sectarianism hypothesis that I think it has its shortcomings. And I think Potter's counterargument adds some helpful nuance to the situation. So I'm going to agree with a fair amount of this, and I hope maybe add a little bit different perspective when we get to the end of my remarks here. So some of the things that Potter asserts as ways of pushing back against or adding complexity to the analysis that the sectarianism hypothesis would give us is he says, you remember one of the kind of defining features of the sectarianism hypothesis as he presents it is that it is age-old, right? It has always been there. As long as there have been Muslims, or at least a few decades into the Islamic into Islamic history, there's a sort of Shiite Sunni split, and this goes back to then, and there's not much we can do about it. His counterargument is that sectarianism may matter, but it's a recent vintage of this, that we need not look back to the earliest time period, but we need to think a little more recently. I would say that one of the frustrations I have with how people talk about the Middle East in general, especially when focused on things like the turmoil in the Middle East, is that we tend to have two possible time frames. One is about 2 or 3 years long. We're able to look back about 2 or 3 years, and we sort of, whatever's going on is defined by whatever just happened last month or the month before, a few months before that. And the other time frame is about 1,300 years long. We're willing to look back to the very beginnings and say, this has its roots in the beginnings, a very essentialistic view to say there's something kind of essential about these people and essential about these traditions and essential about this region that makes this happen. And what gets left out of there is a big time block when a lot of important things happened. And really, the way I think we need to try to, the time frame that I think we need to work with, that I think Potter's counterarguments help us push towards, is not just the last 2 or 3 years and not 1,300 or 1,400 years ago, but about 200 years. Maybe 250 years, something like that. That is the time frame that really matters, right? And I'll come back to this a little bit as we go. But there is sectarianism in the Middle East. But to understand it and make sense of it and to think about trying to do something about it, we need to look at it as something that is shaped by much more recent decades, right? So sectarianism, his counterargument, is subject to political manipulation. That one of the reasons sectarianism is a problem in the Middle East is that people take advantage of this human tendency and exploit it for their own ends. Rather than being sort of time immemorial and sort of this block that can't be touched, he's pointing out that it gets manipulated, often cynically, for various people's purposes. Seemingly sectarian conflicts are then amenable not just to religious mitigation, that we have to change people's faith commitments, but that actually politics could help, right? That we could do things at the political level that could change things. The sectarianism hypothesis overstates sectarian group unity and harmony. Again, I think one of the ways of taking sectarianism seriously is to note that there are multiple factions within these two bigger blocks that may or may not get along with one another, and all sorts of alignments are possible among these different groups. So in some ways, that's the assertion that the sectarianism hypothesis, parts of it are at least pointing in a helpful direction, adding precision to the conversation, the way we were talking about a second ago. But they don't add nearly enough precision, that if that's the direction you're going to go, you can't stop at 2, you have to get much deeper into it. So the Shia, for example, are not a unified bloc. You can obviously point out that the Shia of Iran are Iranian by sort of ethnicity and culture and language, The Shia of Iraq, right next door, are Arabic speaking, and they have sort of affinities and disaffinities, if that's a word, among them. And that's true among lots of different Shi'i groups. I'm going to focus a little bit on Yemen a little bit later and talk about how that is another window on how this thesis runs afoul of sort of sufficient precision and clarity. So the counter-argument goes that sectarianism is a factor, but it's only one among many factors, and the piece gives us a few others to think about. So there's lots of other things that help determine people's behaviors. So ethnicity, which to some extent can overlap with sectarianism and sometimes not, can be a kind of independent variable. Regional interests and regional identities. So even if you have, say, the Shia of Iran are what we would call a 12er Shia, it's the largest of the Shia group. Even if in other parts of the Shia world you have 12ers, if they live in significantly different regional contexts and so forth, they may or may not line up with Iranian interests, right? The legacy of colonialism, right? And this is where we get to this, what do you miss if you only look back 2 or 3 years, and what do you miss if you look back 13 or 1400 years? Well, you miss the legacy of colonialism and the extent to which that reframes identity politics. I'm guessing this isn't news to a lot of you if you follow a series like this one. I'm sure colonialism gets talked about a lot. But I do find it frustrating the extent to which the general conversation in America, journalistic conversation about the Middle East, and even the kind of politics and policy conversation about the Middle East tends to act as though colonialism didn't happen, right? And that, oh, that was such a long time ago, haven't we moved beyond it yet? And, you know, with my students at Lewis and Clark, you know, they're 18, 19 years old. I know it seemed, 50 years ago seems like a long time. But I like to point out to them, there are lots of people alive today who lived under colonial rule in this part of the world, right? They are still alive and well, and they lived under it. And we are still very much sorting out what a post-colonial world is going to look like. I'm a medievalist, so something that happened 50 years ago seems really recent. 100 years ago was really recent to me. And so I'm, I have to remind myself that a lot of people think 50 or 100 years ago is a long time ago. It's not. And the fact that we're still working out what this post-colonial situation will look like shouldn't be so surprising, and that is still very much going on. Potter does a pretty good job, I think, of talking about the emergence of modern nationalism and the way modern nationalism has some kind of maybe unintended consequences. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. Post-colonial international relations, he says, can over-rely on sectarian identity as a framework. So if you identify the sort of good guys and bad guys in your policy framework on an overly simplistic sectarian framework, you can, or you ignore sectarianism. And part of the issue here is to find the sweet spot, which is, I think, a more complicated sectarianism hypothesis. If you can, in effect, reinforce these alignments and make them worse rather than overcome the problems they cause. He talks about modern national borders, reframing sectarian and ethnic group relations. I'll sort of fold that into some wider comments about modern nationalism. So this is one of the things I think Potter does pretty well in the piece, is talk about how nationalism has some of these effects. So it can turn previously semi-autonomous, locally dominant groups into minorities and competitors. So in pre-national frameworks, often groups of people were more or less left to their own affairs in whatever part of the pre-modern frameworks tended to be far less centrally focused, far less sort of sharply bordered than modern nation states. And so if you think of something like the Kurds as an example, that group of people in a pre-modern context weren't divided by modern national borders and were often in a place where they were kind of the majority among themselves. Now, because of the way modern national borders are set up, they are a minority in 3 or 4 different countries and a problematic minority according to the majorities in those countries, right? And this is partly a product of the way modern nation states work. And on this kind of abstract level that I think is important here, nationalism you can think of as having been sort of emerges as an effort to eclipse and unify sort of differing identities, but inadvertently can easily exacerbate some of those differences by forcing people who previously were sort of left alone by the state to compete with one another in the framework of a modern state. In the Middle East and North Africa, the lack of effective political institutions and civil society can make religious groupings more salient. So this is one of the ways that sectarian identities do matter, but are maybe more complicated than a basic sectarian sectarianism hypothesis recognizes. So if you a lot of, Syria before it fell apart, it's still true today, but just thinking about before Syria fell apart, or Egypt prior to and sort of again now, prior to the Arab Spring, there were no political parties, right? There's no opposition party, there's no opposition press, there's no, you can't gather in political groupings, but you can go to the mosque, right? And you can gather for religious purposes. And so that's part of how religion gets so intensely politicized in this part of the world. And so these sectarian groups can be kind of exacerbated, or these sectarian divisions can become a kind of conduit for political dissent. All right, and then I think this is my last slide about Potter's counter-arguments, kind of summing up. So sectarianism matters, but there are a lot more, there's a lot more complexity to it. There's not just 2, right? And even sectarian motivated actions are far less predictable than the sectarianism hypothesis would lead us to expect. So the fact that somebody is a Shiite doesn't mean that he or she or that group is going to align with other ones in any predictable way at all. And then this is the other big part of the counter-argument. There are many factors other than sectarianism that affect behavior in the region. So as I said before, I mostly concur with Potter's counter-argument. And I would, coming from this religious studies background, people often will, there's a sort of old saw that people like to go to, which is to say that religion causes more violence and more wars than anything else around. And this is sort of trotted out as a sort of reason to be resistant to religion. And part of the problem with that is I think historically it's actually pretty rare that we find people harming and killing others with differing religious commitments purely because of those religious commitments. It actually doesn't happen that often, right? And part of the issue is the idea of sort of separating off religious commitments and religious group identity from all sorts of other factors. This doesn't really work in real life, right? That's not how people's identities are sort of operate. Sectarianism. The sectarianism hypothesis adds a kind of pseudo-precision that's often misleading. And again, going back to this thing I suggested earlier, it gives us a sort of time frame and a set of causal factors that help deflect blame from the West for its part in the turmoil, right? European colonialism and American influence in the region and the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and so forth, those were all sort of, they barely happened, or they were sort of benign or neutral events. But what they did was open up this space for this other entity, which is sectarianism, to take flight and cause all sorts of problems, right? As opposed to looking at the ways that colonialism and its sort of successors in the kind of post-colonial framework help explain why this is a rather messy region these days, right? So another way of coming at this is to say that when resources are at stake, which is always, right? When resources are at stake, i.e. always, people align with co-religionists, sort of with the in-group and against outsiders. So the sectarian identity matters, but this would assert that maybe it's not the driving force, but to a certain extent it is the sort of reliance on sectarian identity comes more from kind of competition over resources. And I think that's a more sort of sociologically sound understanding of how religion operates in these kind of contexts. And in the Middle East and North Africa, and a lot of the world, and a lot of human history, America is kind of an outlier in this. This is a sort of function of certain commitments and experiences that only a relatively small part of the humans have ever had. We don't have this as strongly in America. But in most of the world and in most of human history, religion has been an ascribed identity. And that's kind of a technical term referring to an identity that is kind of fixed and objectively identifiable, right? And how do you know that somebody is a member of a particular religious community? Well, it's marked by these objective indicants, such as somebody's name, where they live, if they live in that section of the city or in a village that's identified as being of those people, their language or their dialect of language, their clothing, ethnicity, all sorts of things mark this. But in ways that an outsider often has difficulty seeing, insiders can see this very quickly. Somebody tells you their name and you know a lot about them if you're a local, right? And you know what their religious grouping is, if it's the same as yours or different from yours. And you see that not as something that Americans tend to think that you can change your religion. And if you have a strong ascription approach to the idea of religion, you can't change your religion. Right? This is something that is deeply woven into, it's not just a set of ideas in your head, it's an integral part of your being, right? And so we have to take seriously that people identify one another in these regards. And so a lot of this really amounts to my biggest complaint about the sectarianism hypothesis as it floats around there is that it sort of points in the right direction but doesn't have the courage of its convictions to take seriously what that would mean, right? And to dig much more deeply into how that operates, right? Oh, and another aspect of this sort of ascribed identity is that an individual is widely seen as representative of a group who's not a standalone individual. If you are a member of this particular community, you are seen as a representative of that community, right? And that there's an assumed kind of shared identity and sense of purpose and so forth among that group. So that's something to know that from the outside we can often misunderstand about this part of the world. And the other thing is that competition, since I'm suggesting that competition for resources is really important here, we have to notice that competition over resources is extremely intense today in this part of the world. And by resources, I mean all sorts of things, including access to political power, right? Wealth, jobs, land, power, and so forth. These things are particularly intense for a number of really interesting historical reasons. And I don't think you can understand those specific reasons in this context by looking back either 2 or 3 years or 13 or 1400 years. But you can understand it if you look back 100 years, 150 years, and you take seriously what happened in that time frame. All right? So I'm pushing in this direction to say that the turmoil is largely a product of political and economic factors, not age-old and sort of blunt religious commitments. If you could ease competition for resources, you would ease the sectarianism, right? And that's a much more plausible way to try to reach some sort of progress in the situation than either throwing up your hands and saying these are religious commitments that can't be changed, or saying that the way to change this is to change people's religious commitments. Both of those, I think, are largely non-starters. History of colonial disruption and post-colonial autocratic government needs to be taken very seriously if you're going to try to understand what's actually going on, rather than leaving that part out. And I think that's maybe the most insidious part of the weak version of the sectarianism hypothesis. The problem is they can't get along with each other. The problem is they're intrinsically violent, or their faith is intrinsically violent, or their Quran tells them to kill people, right? Much more to the point is that we have a specific history in the region that we need to take seriously to figure out what's going on now and what a potential solution to any sort of subset of the situation is. Okay, so recent decades of disruption, deprivation, oppression trump the idea of centuries of sectarian hate. And in the Middle East and North Africa, we have this sort of recent openings. And here I'm talking about the various aspects of what we broadly have called the Arab Spring, right, which has taken different guises in different parts of the Middle East and North Africa. But one of the things that's happened with these recent openings is that populations that previously had no opportunity whatsoever to compete for resources now have an opportunity to compete for resources, right? And when people do that, they often line up in sectarian lines. And it's often not especially pretty. All right, so when I talk this way, I realize I might sound a little bit like a Marxist. And in the sense of the Marxist assessment of religion, saying that basically religion doesn't matter, what matters is people's economic circumstances, their material circumstances, sort of Marxist materialism that treats religion as at best a kind of afterthought. And I don't think that I would agree with that. If I were to describe what I think are my intellectual alignments, they would go along with sociologists Durkheim and Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, who I think Durkheim in particular understands religion in a way that we have to understand religion in this context, which is as a key element of social cohesion and social differentiation. So religion matters in the forming of groups and boundaries between groups in really important ways that Marx and Marxists tend not to pay any attention to. And Weber also, I think, is much more subtle in his thinking about how religion interacts with other economic, material, and political factors. So I'm not discounting or relegating religion to the sidelines. I think it certainly matters. But I think in this particular formation of the sectarianism hypothesis, we tend to sort of the sectarianism hypothesis in its strongest form is something like a mirror opposite of with the same weaknesses as Marxism, right? Marxism says religion doesn't matter at all. The strong sectarianism hypothesis says religion is entirely determinative here, and we can't do anything other than sort of, we can't crack that code, right? And in a way, the sectarianism hypothesis is both kind of self-serving and anti-rational, all right? So that was kind of my big picture overview. I was going to talk a little bit about a few details in the region. Just to keep things short, I was going to focus a little bit on Yemen. I don't want to take a lot of time because I want to get the conversation going here. But I just want to point out, for example, the recent speculations that Yemen, because it is supposedly a Shi'i-dominated country, is being drawn into the Iranian nexus and so forth, is a really difficult one for me to believe in any straightforward sense. So what I have here, the tribal Zaydis and economy of Zift. Like if you look at the details of what goes on in Yemen, Yemen is an intensely tribal place. It's sort of physically very rough and isolated. The religious community there, yes, they're Shi'is, but they're not Twelver Shi'is like Iranian Shi'is. They're Zaydi Shi'is. And I won't go into the details, but it's a different sectarian alignment. Very much a case in point to say that all Shi'is are not on the same page. And historically, the Zaydi branch of Shi'ism has usually been seen as the one that kind of in its religious and sort of intellectual frameworks is closest to Sunni Islam. And historically, Zaydi Shi'is have gotten along pretty well with Sunnis because they don't have as deep a difference about some of the things that Shi'is and Sunnis can have disagreements about. And this phrase, zift, that's a Yemeni dialect term meaning sort of dirt, right? What's going on in Yemen? Well, nothing, right? The Yemeni economy is moribund, right? There's virtually nothing going on in the Yemeni economy. I think that I said it's the land that globalization forgot. There's no oil there to really note. There's no import and export. The chairs you're sitting on were not made in Yemen, right? The car you drove in on was not made in Yemen. The oil in the car, not produced in Yemen, right? What's going on in Yemen right now is that you have a country that has very little connection to the globalized economy and is very much kind of on the outs of it. And these hypotheses that want to sort of draw it into this grand... It's not a place that the government has sort of strategic interests. It doesn't reach out and touch the world around it. I'm not trying to insult the place. I quite like the place. But I'm trying to explain that it's not easily fit into some of the frameworks we assume are going on there. All right. Not to mention that what you're talking about there is this sort of odd alignment in which you have Al-Qaeda, which is a Sunni-oriented organization that seems to have made some sort of alliances with Zaidi Shiites in Yemen. And if that doesn't tell you that the situation is messier than a simple sectarianism hypothesis, then nothing will, right? All right, I want to quiet down now, but I have just a few other remarks up here. You can take a look at it. I won't go through all of them, but these are meant to point out the extent to which the situations are much more complicated, and an understanding of them has to be quite a bit more precise than a basic sectarianism hypothesis. For what they're worth, I had a couple of pictures. I traveled in Yemen in the kind of early, mid-90s for a while and had a wonderful experience. And I just wanted to show a few of these things to show, I know it's an urbanizing place and Sana'a is growing quickly and so forth, but an awful lot of Yemenis live in villages with no electricity and no running water and kind of disconnected from the world around them. It's a sort of a place unto itself. And I think one of the things that's probably going on in, you have all these kind of tribal alliances. If Iran, for example, has influence there, it is because it's a dirt-poor country, and if Iran is pumping money in, it might be going somewhere. But it's not going to be a unified Shi'i response, joining a unified Shi'i bloc of anything in the foreseeable future. All right, I had some other things to say about it, but I feel like I'm running a little bit long here. That's a younger version of me back in the day out there in Highland, Yemen, and a couple of nice kids who drove me and a couple friends up into this village area. He kept putting his assault rifle across his lap in the front seats that had pointed right into the back seat where we were all sitting as we rode over these bumpy hills. I didn't think he was going to intentionally shoot us. I was really never worried about that. But I really thought we were going to intentionally be shot to death on our way up into Highland, Yemen. At any rate, all right, I can come back to this, but I just want to shut myself up now so we can hear from you guys. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to do my best to kind of walk around with the microphone, but also because I have the microphone, I'm going to ask the first question.
Please.
You are not a political scientist,
right, as
you said, but I'm wondering if you could comment on, we so frequently in these sort of international, affairs racket, we look at the rational actor scenarios, and so frequently religion is thought of as an irrational factor in the rational actor scenario, but we also know that Pew Research study will tell us that 5.8 billion people around the globe affiliate with religions, and should we be thinking about reconsidering the irrationality of religion when we look at these issues?
Quick answer would be yes. And again, like the patron saint of taking religion seriously in social and political context for me is Max Weber. And that's why I consider myself much more Weberian than, say, a Marxist, because I do think that there, in some ways, the idea that religion is sort of non-rational or a easily dismissed factor has roots in that in a lot of ways. But I do think that if you understand the details, and you do have to understand the details better, you can fit religion into some version of a kind of rational choice or rational actor framework pretty well. If you understand, and this is one of the things I think Weber tried very hard to do, is try to understand how your religious beliefs, practices, social relations, and so forth can help you understand why people do what they do. And I think if that doesn't qualify as a sort of rational possibility, it sort of moves us away from the idea that religion is such an unpredictable and kind of mercurial way, framework, right? Other questions? Yes,
Hi.
please.
I was wondering, considering that you mentioned that the United States, or the West in general, has a large part to play in terms of stoking sectarian tensions, how much, if you could give percentages or a more detailed answer, yeah, how much could you chalk up to Western intervention in the Middle East, and how much is really stoked by regional hegemons like the Wahhabi Hanbali extremists in Saudi Arabia or mullahs in Iran? How much is really is the West really responsible for, and how much is more of an indigenous political infighting between regional actors?
Right. It's a good question, and it's tough to quantify. And maybe the way I would reframe it a little bit is, again, to kind of put it in this historical framework of the past 150, 200 years, something like that. And if you can pay attention to what happens in that time period, you can see how we get into the situation that we're in now. In large part, what happens in about the 1950s and 60s, as you see a decolonization on the part of Europeans, you mostly see a shift towards what I call the SSMDs, the secular socialist military dictatorships of the Middle East and North Africa. Most of those shift into a mode of extreme centralized power, lack of any tolerance of any dissent or so forth. And we spent, 20, 30 years in various places in this sort of locked down mode, right? And what's happening today is for better and for worse, and it is a little bit of each, right? It's kind of a lot of each that moves towards greater self-determination and autonomy for a lot of the populations. Let's take Egypt, for example. Greater autonomy and self-determination is the only way you move in that direction is if you lift, in effect, the lid off of a place that has had the lid on for a long time. This is not a real direct answer to your question, but I think in the case of Egypt, America is kind of caught on the horns of this classic dilemma that America is caught on the horns of throughout the region. Between our perceived kind of moral uprightness and our commitment to things like self-determination and democracy on the one hand, and our desire for stable and predictable goings on in the region, right? Something that we can, to a certain extent, at least help manipulate and at least know which direction it's going. So if you want more stability and predictability for American interests, you probably wanted Mubarak to stay in power, right? But if you want self-determination, you get the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And learning to live with the Muslim Brotherhood isn't so easy for us. One of the things I think about in the specific case of the Muslim Brotherhood is what else was going to happen there, right? What else would have happened? There, as I said before, there's no real political frameworks in place, so the Muslim Brotherhood is a sort of hybrid of religious and political. Sort of steps into that gap. So trying to get back to your specific question, I feel like I'm not trying to duck it, but I'm trying to say the question sort of what is the role of America maybe in a situation like this? Well, part of it is to recognize that some of what's going to happen in the coming years has been going on recently are the result of issues like this. That we are on the horns of a dilemma in this region. We have been for a long time. That our economic interests, especially, don't necessarily line up very well with our moral self-understanding in the region. And we have muddled through that for years and years, and we kind of hopscotch around emphasizing one or the other. And people in the region don't trust us? Like, it's a shock, right? Because which one are we going to emphasize at this particular moment? Who knows, right? You never know. All right, other questions?
I just have a quick question here.
Yes.
Not a question. statement.
Okay.
For somebody who had to read the material twice, thank you for helping put it all in
Oh, sure, yeah.
perspective. It really did help. I feel like we don't have people who are making these decisions that know the whole story, and that, I think, frightens me.
Right. Right. Yeah, be afraid, be very afraid. Again, I'm not a political scientist, so I watch this stuff a little bit more at a remove. Certainly, I know that I plugged into the field that is closer, so I'm in concentric circles connected to this. I know, for example, and this is, I don't want to sort of jump on the sort of Bush bashing bandwagon, but in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and in moving into Afghanistan and Iraq in that time frame, a lot of people in the broader field of Middle East and Islamic studies were aghast at the people that they brought into the inner circle. People who know better than I did how to judge these people and whose opinions I did trust were aghast and said, I don't know that those people know anything about this region. And part of the problem, though, is foreign policy is a fairly blunt instrument, and academics, we have the luxury of always asking people to pay attention to more complexities, and we have to be a little cognizant of the fact that sometimes you have to act without all the information. But I do think there's probably a sweet spot somewhere between knowing what appears to be virtually nothing and getting caught up on the idea that, well, we can't do anything until we know more. We got to know more. Oh, you're not paying attention to enough complexities. So, somebody like me can do that. I have the luxury of not having to make the tough decisions. But I still think, and I hope we have moved a little closer to that direction, to people who understand the region being involved in the decision making. Nobody should pretend that any of this is easy, but that's part of the problem with the sectarianism hypothesis. It feels like a throwing up of hands. It's more like, I can't figure these two out, right? I don't know, that's how I felt this morning with my 7-year-old and 11-year-old kid. Like they're off from school today. I'm like, oh my God, you guys are crazy. This has been going on since you were born. There's nothing I can do about it. Like, it's not very good parenting, right? That's how I left the house today. I'm out of here, right? But that's part of the thing, is you got to find that ground in between the oversimplifying kind of self-serving thing that lets me just walk out of the house and say to my wife, it's your problem, and the part where I just sort of talk it to death, right? I don't know. Other questions? Yes, please.
This on? Okay. Thank you for your lecture. I just had a quick question, and forgive me if I'm mistaken, but in the West, it seems like there's a divide between the church and the state, and that it should be completely two separate things. And in my view, in Islam, it's a bit different in that we believe our religion gives us both spirituality and laws to live peacefully and collectively together. So do you think this difference is a cause of misconceptions, or maybe the supposed sectarian divide in the region?
Absolutely. I think this is another of those kind of big picture frameworks. I mean, the first thing is that the American history of the idea of separation of religion and state is far messier than that simple formulation makes it sound like, right? That if you think that religion doesn't affect the political history of America, obviously you're wrong. Like it does all the time and still to this day. But we have a kind of ideal that we are very inconsistent about, but we have an ideal about those two things being separate. And I think the modern secular nation state, part of how the secular got enshrined in it was as an effort to manage diversity and plurality in a given context. And that's one of the great problems of the modern age, right? How to manage diversity. So part of what Potter points out is that, and that I was trying to emphasize, I think this is one of his good points, is that modern nation-state frameworks in theory, they are unified blocks. In reality, they're often kind of trampling over the diversity within them. America is really weird in this case in that we're one of the history's great experiments in trying to manage a truly diverse society and let sort of that flourish. Most human societies have not done that. Mostly we have, as a species, tried to eliminate difference. So that's sort of pushing in one direction. But coming back to your question, this goes a little bit back to what I was saying about the Muslim Brotherhood before. I think for the foreseeable future, if what the rest of the world should expect is that if Muslim majority societies, especially ones that have had autocratic leadership over them for a while, if they move in the direction of greater self-determination and democracy and so forth, will Islamicize the government more, right? That the Muslim Brotherhood is really the most predictable route you would expect to go. Because I think an awful lot of Muslims would agree with what you were saying, which is that a lot of Muslims think that religion and politics can work together pretty well, right? And that they kind of have to. And part of my remarks about the church-state, the ideology of a separation of church and state is that that's a little bit misleading about what we do here. Really what we try to do is weave them together comfortably, right? And I do think that in a way, in the Middle East and North Africa in particular, the possibility of trying to do that hasn't been taken up very far, right? The cases where people claim that it has been tried are post-revolutionary Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I know very few Muslims outside of those countries who think of those as models that they want to emulate. But they do want to have a government that reflects Islamic principles, right? And is shaped by them, rather than sees that as a purely privatized thing. Now, I guess so I think I'm largely agreeing with you. I guess maybe what I would add to it is that people who feel that way haven't had very much opportunity to try to put it into practice yet. And when something like the Muslim Brotherhood moves in that direction, the West reacts like, oh, that's not, we can't, oh no, right, can't do that, right? As if that's just out of the question. And I don't think you can have self-determination in Islamic societies without a kind of Islamization of the political framework. And where it goes, I don't see there's any reason to assume it has to go badly, right? I guess we have to see where it goes, yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned difficult decisions, and this week guests on the NewsHour have been debating whether to increase sanctions on Iran or not. And of course, our Congress and our president, our government is divided on this. So do you have comments on that? If you were in Congress now, or if you were the president, what do you think the outlook is for a decision that the United States makes in this regard?
Yeah, right. I don't want to overstate the simplicity of the situation or anything like that. I think it's a tough one, and I don't know. There's probably things I don't know that would shape my decision on this. It seems to me that we're in a moment with our relations with Iran that more conversation is potentially fruitful right now, and that sanctions increasing sanctions would probably undermine that prospect. My feeling is that it's worth right now. Is it a gamble? Yeah, it's potentially a gamble, right? Is it the case that Iran is trying to develop a nuclear weapon, and if they did that, would that be a bad thing? It's tough to say that the world would be a better place if Iran had a nuclear weapon. It's a tough thing to say that, right? That's not a sentence that comes easily out of my mouth, right? I don't know enough to know for sure exactly how sanctions at this moment affect that. But I do think that more sanctions don't make that less likely. I do think that conversation and an effort to sort of integrate Iran more fully rather than isolate Iran from the kind of globalizing economy and political framework is much more promising from where I sit. So if it's a zero sum and sanctions reduce the possibility of conversation, unless there are things I don't know, and I'm sure there are, but as far as I can tell, I would rather gamble on that conversation because it looks like it could go somewhere. Sanctions is not going to stop the bad outcome. And since that's not going to stop the bad outcome, maybe this other direction could. Maybe maybe if I double down on my pessimism, I can end up with sounding optimistic, I guess. So that would be my quick response. Yeah. Okay.
I, too, thank you very much for what you've brought to this audience, and thank everybody for the interest that's brought you here. In many ways, I look at where we are as a people in America as kind of in that kindergarten stage of just starting to catch on to what the other side of the world does and thinks and their history, and let alone our understanding of religion. I was in the Army for 22 years. I was in the Gulf War. And at that point, we very simplistically looked at the Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south, and that was about the extent of our knowledge of the culture and issues at hand. In 2008, I trained to go over as an advisor, and we had become enlightened to the point that we figured out that the Shia and the Sunnis were the two major divisions, and that the Kurds were an ethnicity. They hated the Arabs, and the Arabs hated the Kurds. And I've since learned, since coming back, that there's arguably over 150 sects of Islam. And that really complicates things, but it should broaden our understanding to realize that with that many sects, and when you consider that there's about 600 or more versions of Christianity, that there just isn't a simple answer of just simply labeling folks. And I think you've done a great job in illustrating that today. Well, I wonder if you'd talk to that point relative to the
I'd say a couple things. Thanks for your service, among other things. And the other thing I would say is part of what you're talking about there is a heartening thing, and the sectarianism thesis in a way is a heartening thing because, like I said, it is an effort to add precision. And one of the things you just talked about is learning an awful lot about a region that you went from knowing very little to knowing much more and being much more effective. And we should give ourselves credit and our policymakers and so forth credit for having made those efforts, right? And so I wouldn't want to downplay that too far and say that we're completely ignorant of those things. And I do think, this goes back to this other question. I do hope there are plenty of people, I think even involved in the government, who have come to understand these things much better than we did, in the early 90s or something like that. Much better than then. And we should give ourselves credit for that, and that helps, right? But there's still a long way to go. I do think that there are peculiarities, too, of this issue about sort of competition for resources is a thing that, yes, there may be multiple sectarian frameworks in the Islamic world, but through a lot of human history, the political and economic frameworks were such that they often didn't have to compete intensely with one another. And I do think that is much more true today than it used to be. So that sectarian divisions that in the medieval world could sit there and nothing would sort of activate them and turn them into a problem, today get activated all the time by these sort of economic and political frameworks. And just trying to understand them is no picnic, and people are trying to do this as best they can. But the stakes are kind of high, too, right? You can really make things significantly worse by going in with a bad understanding of these things. So there's no particular easy solution. Maybe we can end on a positive note and note that the sort of worst sins of the bad version of the sectarianism hypothesis are kind of a caricature of where a lot of us are. I think we actually are better off than that. But we need to understand what's at stake better and recognize our role in making it worse, to think more clearly about what we might do to make it better. Maybe I can end on that. So. Right.
That is a great note to end on. Okay. So let's give Paul Powers a big hand.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll see you all next week.